The sun hung low over Maplewood, South Carolina, painting the sky with hues of gold and amber. The town was alive with its usual charm, children riding bicycles along the tree-lined streets, neighbors exchanging pleasantries over white picket fences, and the aroma of freshly baked pies wafting from kitchen windows. To the casual observer, Maplewood was idyllic, a postcard-perfect slice of small-town America. But beneath its picturesque surface lay a web of unspoken truths and buried tensions. In one of the town's modest yet well-kept homes, Emma Carter stood by the kitchen sink, absently washing a stack of dishes. The rhythmic clink of porcelain against the faucet was the only sound in the room. She gazed out the window at her husband, Ethan Carter, who was hunched over his tool set in the backyard. His focus was absolute, his strong hands methodically working on a wooden bench he had promised to repair weeks ago. Ethan was the embodiment of diligence and responsibility, a man whose loyalty to his family was unquestionable. But to Emma, his loyalty felt cold, like a sturdy wall that kept her on one side and him firmly on the other. The laughter, the warmth, the intimacy they once shared had been eroded over the years by the grind of life. Ethan worked tirelessly in construction, pouring his energy into ensuring their stability, but he was blind to the emotional void that grew within his wife. Emma wiped her hands on a dish towel and sighed. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and a forced smile. The vibrant, carefree girl she had once been felt like a distant memory. She turned away from the window, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken needs and unmet desires. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma and Ethan arrived at a barbecue hosted by her younger sister, Lila Harper, and Lila's husband, Ryan Harper. Their home, a charming colonial-style house nestled at the edge of Maplewood, buzzed with activity. Lila's infectious energy filled every corner of the yard as she greeted guests with her signature warmth, her laughter rising above the clatter of grilling meat and the chatter of children playing tag. Emma admired her sister's effortless charisma, but it also stung. Lila seemed to have it all, a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a zest for life that Emma couldn't muster. Ryan, with his confident demeanor and easy charm, was the center of attention, cracking jokes and swapping stories with the other guests. To Emma, the Harpers' world felt like a stage where she was only a spectator. As the evening wore on, Emma found herself alone in a quiet corner of the yard, nursing a glass of sweet tea and gazing at the sunset. The vibrant hues reminded her of a time when her own life had been painted with similar shades of passion and joy. But now, those colors felt muted, almost forgotten. "Penny for your thoughts," a voice broke her reverie. Emma turned to find Ryan standing beside her, a relaxed smile playing on his lips. He held out a glass of lemonade. "You looked like you could use a refill." Emma hesitated before accepting the drink, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling a warmth in his gaze that unsettled her. They stood in silence for a beat, the hum of the barbecue fading into the background. "You know," Ryan began, his tone light yet sincere, "you used to be the life of these get-togethers. What happened?" Emma's chest tightened at the question, but she forced a smile. "Life happened." Ryan chuckled softly, but his eyes lingered on her, searching for something deeper. "Well, life has a way of taking things, doesn't it? Sometimes you just have to take something back." Emma's pulse quickened, the weight of his words settling over her like a shadow. She looked away, unsure of whether it was the truth or temptation she had just heard in his voice. The evening air grew heavier, and for the first time in years, Emma felt seen, but it was a feeling laced with danger. The days following the barbecue brought little change to Emma Carter's routine. Morning sunlight filtered through her curtains, casting soft patterns on her modest bedroom walls, but the warmth it brought was fleeting. Ethan would already be gone, his work boots leaving faint traces of mud on the front mat. The house, though tidy and well-kept, felt empty, a structure that held memories but little life. That afternoon, Emma found herself strolling through the heart of Maplewood, a place she knew like the back of her hand. The streets bustled with quiet activity, a florist arranging bouquets, children sharing ice cream cones, and the soft chime of a bell as someone entered the diner. It was a small town, predictable and comfortable in its rhythm. Yet, Emma felt like an outsider looking in, unable to find her place in the familiarity. She entered Coffee Haven, the cozy cafe nestled in the corner of Main Street. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint sound of soft jazz offered a brief respite from her thoughts. As Emma approached the counter, a familiar voice called her name. Turning, she saw Ryan Harper, leaning casually against a table, his eyes lighting up as he waved her over. "Emma. Fancy running into you here," he said, his tone easy and inviting. "Ryan," she replied, hesitating before walking over. "Didn't expect to see you out in the middle of the day." "Lila kicked me out," he joked, smirking. "Apparently, I'm terrible at staying out of her way while she's rearranging the living room. Needed a place to lay low." Emma chuckled despite herself. "Well, you found the perfect hiding spot." Their conversation began with the usual pleasantries, trading updates about Maplewood and the recent barbecue. But as the minutes ticked by, their words took on a more personal tone. Ryan spoke about his long workdays, his dissatisfaction with the monotony of his routine, and his longing for something more. Emma found herself nodding, her own unspoken thoughts mirrored in his words. "You know," Ryan said, his gaze steady, "I always thought you had it all figured out. Perfect husband, perfect house, but I guess it's not always that simple, is it?" Emma's breath caught, the vulnerability in his voice drawing her in. "No," she admitted softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "It's not." The air between them shifted, growing heavier yet strangely comforting. Emma felt a pull she couldn't quite explain, a connection that both intrigued and alarmed her. When she finally rose to leave, Ryan placed a hand on her arm, his touch light but grounding. "Hey," he said, his voice dropping, "if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Emma nodded, her thoughts swirling as she stepped outside. The sun was bright, but her world felt dimmed by an undeniable tension she couldn't shake. The encounters became less accidental and more deliberate in the weeks that followed. A chance meeting at the grocery store led to a conversation in the parking lot. A quick wave on the street turned into an extended chat by the bench near the town square. Each interaction was innocuous enough on the surface, but beneath it, Emma felt an electric current she couldn't ignore. It was a Thursday afternoon when Ryan texted her for the first time. "Coffee? My treat." The message was simple, innocent even, but Emma hesitated. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she replied, "Sure. Coffee Haven at 3? Sitting across from him at the cafe, Emma couldn't deny the ease she felt in Ryan's presence. His laughter was warm, his attention unwavering. He noticed things about her, things Ethan hadn't mentioned in years. The way she wore her hair differently today. How she smiled when she talked about her favorite book. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being seen. Ryan, for his part, was equally drawn to Emma. There was a quiet strength in her, a depth he found irresistible. His charm came naturally, but with Emma, it felt less like a performance and more like an authentic connection. They began texting regularly, at first about small things, the weather, local news, a funny story from the grocery store. But soon, their messages turned more personal. Ryan asked about her dreams, her regrets, her joys. Emma responded with honesty she hadn't shared with anyone in years. Their first intentional meeting outside the cafe happened a week later. Ryan had asked Emma for help picking out a gift for Lila's birthday, claiming he had no sense for these things. Emma agreed, and they met at the town's boutique. It was harmless, she told herself, a favor for her sister's husband. But as they browsed the shelves together, their shoulders brushing and their laughter mingling, the line between right and wrong blurred. Ryan's hand lingered on her back as he thanked her, and Emma felt her heart race in a way she hadn't experienced in years. When she returned home that evening, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, but the thrill of being wanted, being seen, was too alluring to resist. Emma stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the fading light, and for the first time in years, she felt alive, but it was a life shadowed by guilt and uncertainty. It started with a feeling, that quiet but persistent itch at the back of Lila Harper's mind. At first, she dismissed it. After all, she and Ryan had been married for 5 years, and despite his occasional aloofness, their life seemed solid. But as the summer days rolled on, little things began to gnaw at her. Ryan had been acting different. And so had Emma. It was subtle at first. Ryan suddenly had more errands to run, often returning hours later than expected with vague excuses about running into an old friend or getting caught up in work calls. He had always been a charismatic man, someone who thrived on being the center of attention, but lately, his charm felt forced. Lila noticed him zoning out during dinner conversations, his phone always within arm's reach, face down on the table. Emma, too, was behaving oddly. Her once subdued demeanor had shifted, though not in an overtly obvious way. She seemed more energetic, more attentive to her appearance, as if some unseen spark had reignited inside her. Lila, always observant, couldn't help but notice how Emma often avoided direct eye contact during family gatherings or how she would excuse herself early, claiming exhaustion or errands of her own. The first real red flag appeared one humid July evening. Lila and Ryan were sitting in their living room, a light breeze rustling the curtains as they watched a rerun of their favorite show. Ryan's phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up the darkened room. Lila's eyes flicked to the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. The message read, "Let's talk soon. I miss you." The sender's name? Emma Carter. For a moment, Lila froze, her mind racing. The words seemed innocent enough, but the timing was off. Why was Emma texting her husband late at night? And why did the message feel so personal? Lila swallowed hard, trying to ignore the pang of doubt rising in her chest. "Your phone," she said, her voice carefully even. Ryan reached for it quickly, almost too quickly, and chuckled. "Just Emma," he said lightly, unlocking the screen and typing a quick response before setting it back down. "She's probably bored. You know how she gets." Lila forced a smile, but her heart pounded in her ears. Something didn't feel right. Emma and Ryan had always been friendly, after all, they were family, but this seemed different. Over the next few days, Lila began to pay closer attention. She watched Ryan's movements more carefully, noticing how he seemed to leave the house at odd times with increasingly flimsy excuses. "Just grabbing a coffee," he'd say, or "I need to check on something at the office." Each time, he returned with that same easy grin, but Lila's instincts whispered otherwise. Emma, too, became a focus of Lila's scrutiny. At a Sunday dinner hosted at the Carter home, Lila observed her sister closely. Emma was cheerful, perhaps a little too much so, and she avoided Ryan's gaze like the plague. When Ryan offered to help clear the table, Lila caught the briefest flicker of tension between them, a quick, darting glance that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. To Lila, it spoke volumes. The breaking point came when Lila stumbled upon Ryan's unlocked phone one afternoon. He had left it charging in the kitchen while he showered, a rare lapse in his usual guarded behavior. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering over the device. A part of her felt guilty. Invading his privacy wasn't something she wanted to do. But the nagging suspicion wouldn't let her rest. She unlocked the phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through his recent messages. Most were benign, mundane exchanges with coworkers and friends. But then she saw the thread with Emma. The texts were innocuous enough on the surface, questions about groceries, updates on family plans, but Lila's heart sank as she read between the lines. There was a familiarity in their words, an ease that felt too intimate. One message in particular made her stomach churn: "Today was amazing. I haven't laughed like that in years." Today? Lila's mind raced. Ryan had told her he spent the afternoon at a work meeting, but now she wasn't so sure. That evening, Lila decided to confront Ryan. She waited until after dinner, the tension in the air palpable as she cleared the dishes and set them in the sink. Ryan sat at the table, scrolling through his phone as if nothing was amiss. "Ryan," she began, her voice steady but tinged with steel, "we need to talk." He glanced up, his brows knitting together. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Are you and Emma seeing each other?" For a moment, Ryan froze, his face a mask of surprise and something else: guilt. His mouth opened to respond, but the hesitation was enough. Lila saw the flicker of panic in his eyes before he forced a laugh. "What are you talking about?" he said, shaking his head. "Emma's your sister." "Of course not." But Lila wasn't convinced. "Don't lie to me, Ryan," she pressed, her voice rising. "I've seen the messages. I've seen the way you act around her. Something's going on, and I deserve the truth." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Lila, it's not what you think. Emma's been going through a hard time, and I've been trying to be there for her. That's all." But the words rang hollow. Lila's instincts screamed that there was more to the story, and as she stared at her husband, the foundation of her trust began to crack. In the quiet of their home that night, Lila felt a storm brewing. The doubt, the unease, the anger, it was all bubbling to the surface, and she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. The summer heat in Maplewood was relentless, and the oppressive air seemed to mirror the tension brewing in Lila Harper's chest. Days had passed since her confrontation with Ryan, but the conversation had left her more unsettled than ever. His dismissals felt rehearsed, his excuses hollow. Lila had always trusted her instincts, and now, they screamed at her to dig deeper. On a humid August afternoon, Lila sat in her living room, staring at her phone. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, but the warmth it brought felt distant. She scrolled through her messages, lingering on her thread with Emma Carter, her older sister. The exchanges were polite, superficial even, questions about family dinners and birthday plans. Yet, something about Emma's tone lately felt off. Too cheerful. Too forced. Unable to shake the feeling, Lila decided to pay Emma a surprise visit. She grabbed her keys and headed out, the drive to the Carter home taking less than 10 minutes. As she pulled up, her heart raced. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but the sight of Emma's empty driveway set her on edge. Lila decided to check Coffee Haven, the small cafe where she'd often run into Emma. It was a long shot, but the nagging voice in her head urged her forward. The familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted her as she stepped inside, and her eyes scanned the room. And there they were. Emma and Ryan, seated in a corner booth, leaning closer than necessary. Their heads were bowed in conversation, and Emma laughed, a soft, unguarded sound Lila hadn't heard from her in years. Ryan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face, and the gesture sent a chill down Lila's spine. For a moment, Lila stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the scene. The air seemed to thicken around her as she fought the surge of emotions threatening to overtake her. Anger. Betrayal. Disbelief. She stormed toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Both Emma and Ryan looked up at the sound, their faces draining of color as they met her fiery gaze. "Lila," Emma stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan started to rise, but Lila's glare pinned him in place. "Don't," she snapped. "Don't you dare move." The cafe had fallen silent, the murmur of other patrons ceasing as all eyes turned to the unfolding drama. Lila ignored them, her focus razor-sharp on the two people who had shattered her trust. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "You've been sneaking around behind my back. How long has this been going on?" "Lila, it's not what you think," Ryan began, his tone placating, but she cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Not what I think," she spat. "You're sitting here with my sister, Ryan. What am I supposed to think?" Emma's eyes brimmed with tears, and she reached out as if to calm her sister. "Lila, please," she pleaded. "It's not like that." Lila stepped back, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. "Then tell me, Emma," she said, her voice breaking. "What is it like? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been betraying me in the worst possible way." Emma opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, the weight of her guilt rendering her speechless. The silence spoke volumes, and Lila felt her heart splinter. Later that evening, Lila sat in her car, parked just outside the Harper home. She stared blankly at the dashboard, the events of the day replaying in her mind. Her confrontation at the cafe had ended with Emma and Ryan stumbling over half-hearted apologies, their attempts to explain drowned out by her own anger. But the confrontation hadn't brought her peace. If anything, it had left her more unsettled. She needed answers, clear, undeniable proof of the betrayal she already knew in her heart was true. When she entered the house, she found Ryan in the living room, his head in his hands. He looked up as she walked in, his expression a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "Lila," he started, but she held up a hand. "Don't," she said, her voice cold. "I don't want your excuses. I want the truth." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally. "It just did." Lila's chest tightened, her worst fears confirmed. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Since June," Ryan admitted, his eyes dropping to the floor. "It started with coffee, and it just got out of hand." Lila laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. "Coffee? Is that what you're calling it? Out of hand doesn't even begin to describe this." Meanwhile, Emma sat in her darkened kitchen, her phone buzzing incessantly with missed calls from Lila. She couldn't bring herself to answer, knowing that nothing she said could undo the damage she'd caused. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, the connection she'd clung to with Ryan now feeling like an anchor pulling her deeper into despair. She thought of Ethan, the husband she had drifted so far from, and wondered how he would react when he inevitably found out. Would he forgive her? Or would he walk away, leaving her to face the wreckage of their lives alone? For Lila, the betrayal wasn't just about Ryan, it was about Emma, her sister, the one person she had trusted implicitly. That trust was gone now, replaced by a hollow ache that consumed her every thought. As the night stretched on, Lila made a decision. This wasn't over. She would confront both Emma and Ryan again, but not in public, not in the heat of the moment. She needed to make them face the full weight of what they'd done, to strip away their excuses and force them to see the devastation they'd wrought. And she wouldn't do it alone. She picked up her phone and dialed Ethan's number, her resolve hardening with each ring. The air was heavy with tension as the car wound its way up the narrow dirt road leading to the secluded cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Lila Harper sat in the passenger seat, her jaw tight and her hands clenched in her lap. Beside her, Ethan Carter gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Neither had spoken much during the drive. Words felt inadequate for the storm of emotions brewing between them, anger, betrayal, and a shared determination to face the truth head-on. The cabin came into view, a rustic structure surrounded by towering trees. It was far enough from Maplewood to ensure privacy, a fact Ethan had chosen deliberately. He had called the meeting, insisting that they confront Emma and Ryan in a place where there would be no interruptions, no distractions. This was about closure, about forcing their spouses to account for their actions. As they stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet seemed deafening in the stillness. Ethan glanced at Lila, his expression unreadable. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. Lila nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I'm ready." Emma and Ryan arrived minutes later, their demeanor tense and uncertain. Emma stepped out of the car first, her eyes darting nervously between her sister and her husband. Ryan followed, his usual confidence replaced by a guarded wariness. As the two approached the cabin, Ethan and Lila stood silently by the door, their expressions grim. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The four of them sat around the small living room, the crackling of the fireplace the only sound as the confrontation loomed. Ethan was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Emma. "Do you even understand the damage you've caused?" Emma flinched, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Ethan, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I was lonely. I didn't know how to fix us." "Fix us?" Ethan barked, his voice rising. "You didn't try to fix anything, Emma. You ran straight to my brother-in-law and started sneaking around behind my back." Lila turned her attention to Ryan, her eyes blazing with anger. "And you," she said, her voice shaking. "You're supposed to be my husband. My partner. How could you do this to me? To us?" Ryan opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her accusations. "Lila, I never wanted to hurt you," he said finally. "But things between us haven't been the same for a while. You know that. That's your excuse?" Lila shot back, her voice breaking. "You felt disconnected, so you decided to destroy our marriage? And with my sister, no less?" The argument escalated quickly, voices overlapping in a cacophony of pain and recrimination. Ethan's fury boiled over as he stood abruptly, towering over Ryan. "You think you can just waltz into my life, into my marriage, and take what's mine?" he growled. "You think there are no consequences for what you've done?" Ryan rose to his feet, his own temper flaring. "I didn't take anything, Ethan," he retorted, his voice edged with defiance. "Emma came to me. She needed someone who actually listened to her, someone who cared." The words were like gasoline on an open flame. Ethan lunged at Ryan, shoving him backward into a wooden chair. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin as the two men grappled, their fists flying in a blur of anger and frustration. "Stop it!" Emma screamed, rushing forward in an attempt to separate them. Lila joined her, grabbing Ethan's arm, but the two men were too far gone, their rage consuming them. Ryan managed to break free, his chest heaving as he pushed Ethan away. "You want to blame me for this?" he shouted. "Look at yourself, Ethan. You're the one who pushed her away. You're the one who made her feel invisible." Ethan froze for a moment, the words hitting him like a physical blow. But the anger quickly returned, sharper and more volatile. He swung at Ryan again, his fist connecting with the side of his face. Ryan stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of a rug. He fell hard, his head striking the corner of a heavy wooden coffee table with a sickening thud. The room fell silent. Ryan lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Emma dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to rouse him. "Ryan," she cried, her voice cracking with panic. "Wake up. Please, wake up." Lila stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at the scene before her. Ethan staggered back, his face pale as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I didn't mean to," Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's sobs filled the room as she cradled Ryan's lifeless body. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she murmured, her tears falling onto his bloodied shirt. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Outside, the sound of approaching sirens broke through the stillness of the night. Lila turned to Ethan, her face a mask of grief and disbelief. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was stand there, staring at the consequences of their collective rage, the weight of the night pressing down on him like a vice. As the police arrived and the cabin was flooded with red and blue lights, one thing was clear: their lives would never be the same. The morning air in Maplewood was unusually still, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The news of what had transpired at the cabin had spread quickly, shattering the facade of tranquility the town was known for. Ryan Harper was dead, and Ethan Carter had been taken into custody, facing charges of manslaughter. For the families involved, nothing would ever be the same. Emma Carter sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen of her home. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that came after a storm. She stared at the cold cup of coffee in front of her, her thoughts swirling like a relentless tide. Ryan's face haunted her, his smile, his touch, and the way he had made her feel alive again. But now, all that remained was guilt and regret. She had told herself so many lies to justify their affair, convincing herself it was harmless, a way to escape the emptiness in her marriage. But it wasn't harmless. It had destroyed her relationship with Ethan, fractured her bond with Lila, and ultimately cost Ryan his life. She glanced at her phone, the screen still showing unanswered texts from Lila. She wanted to reach out, to explain, to apologize. But what could she possibly say? Sorry wasn't enough to mend the rift she had created. Meanwhile, Lila stood in what used to be her and Ryan's bedroom, packing the last of her belongings. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, a cruel reminder of the life they had shared. She placed a framed photo of them on their wedding day into a box, her hands trembling. The betrayal still burned, but the grief was sharper. Ryan was gone, and so was the future she had envisioned with him. Lila had spent days replaying every moment in her head, trying to understand how it had come to this. She had trusted Emma, her sister, with her life. Now, that trust was shattered, replaced by a bitterness she couldn't shake. Forgiveness felt impossible. The bond they had once shared seemed irreparably broken. As Lila closed the box, she resolved to leave Maplewood. The town, once her home, now felt like a prison filled with painful memories. She needed space to heal, to rebuild. But she couldn't leave without one final act. She picked up her phone and dialed Emma's number. The call went to voicemail. "Emma," she began, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, but I need to move on. I hope you can find a way to fix whatever's left of your life. Goodbye." Ethan, now sitting in a Stark jail cell, reflected on his choices. The weight of Ryan's death pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had let his anger consume him, and it had led to tragedy. But as much as he blamed himself, he couldn't ignore the cracks that had already been forming in his marriage. He had failed Emma in many ways, shutting her out emotionally even when she had tried to reach him. But betrayal was not the answer, and now they were both paying the price. The fallout rippled through the town. Neighbors whispered about the tragedy, their speculation weaving its way into every corner of Maplewood. The once respected Carter and Harper families were now at the center of a scandal that would not be forgotten. Emma avoided the public eye, retreating into the solitude of her home. She spent her days reflecting on her actions and the consequences they had wrought. Her marriage to Ethan was beyond saving. The love they had once shared was now buried under layers of resentment and pain. Lila left Maplewood a week later, driving away with her belongings packed tightly into the back of her car. As she crossed the town limits, she felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to navigate. Months later, Emma found a letter in her mailbox. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, chilling message. Ryan wasn't who you thought he was. He had secrets, secrets that might explain everything. You'll find what you're looking for in the old safe at the cabin. Emma's hands trembled as she reread the note. Was this a cruel prank? Or was there more to Ryan's story than she had realized? The question gnawed at her, leaving her with a decision to make. Could she confront the ghosts of her past, or would she let them haunt her forever? The story of Emma, Ryan, Ethan, and Lila is one of betrayal, guilt, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. But what about you? Who do you think is most to blame for how things unfolded? Could Ethan and Emma's marriage have been saved if they had communicated better? Do you think Lila was right to walk away, or should she have tried to rebuild her life in Maplewood? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think about this story. What would you have done differently? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this. Thank you for watching.